Hi heroes! So I wanted to give you a little bit of extra resource today talking about annotating in the Book Thief. So remember, the three main things we're annotating for are character, using steel, conflict, and figurative language. The other thing that I'm wanting you guys to pay attention to and be on the lookout for are theme seeds. Okay, so as we go through this book, because remember we're going to be using this book for our literary analysis in quarter 3, and so we're going to be comparing it to the literary value novel that you have self-chosen and that you're annotating for all of these things as well. So make sure you're annotating for these things and making notes for these things in your literary value novels as well. But this is what we're going to look at today with the Book Thief, looking back here in chapter 1 and just to give you some examples of how to annotate and what to look for as you go through, right? So keep that in mind. So I'm going to walk you through chapter 1, which is Arrival on Himmel Street, and we started reading this today in class already. And so I'm going to pick up close to where we left off to give you guys an idea of where and how we can be doing some annotation for character, for conflict, and for figurative language here in our novel. So I could pick up where we left off. Starting here actually might not be a bad idea since we read this already, and we'll go through and we'll close read again. Okay, so I'll have my pen and I'll have my highlighter so you guys will see these coming back and forth as we go through. So looking at chapter 1, so we're here on page 19, looking at chapter 1, the Arrival on Himmel Street. So now we're going to zero in. Death in the prologue gave us kind of a preview of Liesel. And so now we're zeroing, Death is going to zero in and actually start to tell us her story. Remember Death's words, "Come with me, I'll tell you a story, I'll show you something." That last time, that red sky. How does a book thief end up kneeling and howling and flanked by a man-made heap of ridiculous, greasy, cooked-up rubble? Look at this figurative language here that Death is using to describe the destruction in Himmel Street. He gave us a bit of a preview in that last part of the prologue, letting us know that Himmel Street, this place here, is eventually going to be destroyed by bombings. And so look how he describes that ridiculous, greasy, cooked up rubble. So kind of looking at this and seeing how Death describes just all of this destruction. So looking at that and looking at how Death uses that figurative language, remember Death is not human. Death is otherworldly. And so just this idea of how Death sees the pointlessness of this. The pointlessness of that destruction. Okay? So the pointlessness of destruction and just this one war, okay? So he gives it this really kind of cynical view to it, doesn't he? So a spectacularly tragic moment. So notice here we have this point of view. We have this big issue with point of view in this book. So we have this first person POV with our narrator, interjected almost by second person POV, when we have these little asides here. So an aside is when the narrator stops or character stops and actually speaks to the audience. And that's what he's doing here. That's what Death is doing here. I should say they, because it's Death. I don't know if Death has a gender, but whatever. So here Death interrupts themselves, frequently in this aside, speaking directly to us as readers. So that's going to be interesting and to see how that develops as the story goes on. The book thief and her brother were traveling down toward Munich, where they would soon be given over to foster parents. We know now, of course, that the boy didn't make it, right? So looking at this page, at the next page here. And so looking through and reminding ourselves of here we find Death telling us about the death of Liesel's brother on the train. Okay? And so here we have this description of the boy when he has just died. And so here we have this description. A suddenness found its way onto his lips then, which were a corroded brown color and peeling like old paint, in desperate need of redoing. Here we have some more figurative language describing Werner, which is Liesel's little brother. So we have this figurative language here, this simile, describing Werner in these first few moments after he's died, what he looks like in that moment. And Death is very good with description, as we know. Death is very good. And so we have this simile here, so he can paint that picture for us. With one eye open, one still in a dream, the book thief, also known as Liesel Memminger, so here's our character's name, could see without question that her younger brother Werner was now sideways and dead. His blue eyes stared at the floor, seeing nothing. Here he describes the dream that Liesel had been having right before she woke up and found her brother. She was having this dream of being at a rally where the Führer was speaking, that he bent down to her and spoke to her, and she spoke to him, basically, "Hello, Herr Führer, how are you?" And so, looking here, and I love this, Liesel, talking about Liesel because she speaks to the Führer in her dream, says she hadn't learned to speak too well or even to read, as she had rarely frequented school. The reason for that, she would find out in due course. So here's Liesel. As we can see here, she's 9 years old, but she can't speak very well, and she can't read very well, if at all. So here we have an interesting piece of conflict. And this is going to be end up being both an external and internal conflict, because here Liesel can't read, can't speak very well either. So here we have something that's going to end up, as we can guess, especially if she's 9 and she can't read, this is going to end up being an interesting piece of conflict as we move through the story, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So conflict, it can be both internal, Liesel struggling with her own inability to do some of these things, as well as external, causing her trouble, for example, when she does eventually go to school and when she finds out why she can't speak or read too well. Okay, so here's a bit of conflict, a little hint at some conflict that's going on. We also have some conflict right here. Right here. This is a spectacular piece of conflict. Liesel's brother is dead. And so here in the next section, Death tells us about Liesel waking up. Just as Death has taken the boy's soul, Liesel wakes up. She says, "Ist ihm nicht," this isn't happening, this isn't happening. And she shakes her brother to try to wake him up. Death says, why do they always shake them? So here we have this description of what happens next. Here's Liesel in the midst of this conflict, both external and internal conflict as well. Her brother's gone. She can't believe it. But that makes an external conflict as well, because now she and her mother, what are they going to do? So look at this more figurative language here, the way that Death describes Liesel's heart, how her heart is beating at that point. It was slippery, her heart was slippery and hot and loud, so loud. Imagine what it would take for Death to call your heartbeat loud. Here in these moments right after Liesel's brother, she discovers her brother is gone, we can see some really good still moments. Remember when we look at steel, we're looking at what the character says, what they think, the effect they have on others, their actions, even their looks. So notice here, she says, this isn't happening. This isn't happening. She shakes her brother, trying to wake him up. So here are all the actions and words of grief. So we can look at this being, we see Liesel in sudden grief, that utter disbelief, that utter, oh, I can't, this can't be happening, this can't be true. Okay. So here we can see some of those steel characteristics, that characterization here. For Liesel Memminger, it says when he took her brother's spirit in his arms, his soul started melting. It was cold, but it started to warm. It started to heal. It started to become what it should be. Unlike Liesel, in contrast, Liesel was there, said for Liesel Memminger, there was the imprisoned stiffness of movement and the staggered onslaught of thoughts. She's waking up. She's realizing that her brother is gone. And her body and her mind are reacting to that. While his soul is healing in death's arms, here's Liesel falling apart, though she's still alive. So the actions and words of sudden grief here. Look at the words here that Zusak has Death used to describe what happened with Liesel and with her mother. So look at this. We have distraught, this idea of clumsy silence, bits and pieces of floating despair, drowning in the train. Look at these words and the choices that Zusak has made here to get that emotion across, looking at grief, looking at despair, looking at loss. So, I mean, this idea, we have grief, we have despair here, we have loss. These could possibly be theme seeds that we're going to see later as we go through this book. They could blossom into wider themes later on, but right now I can see these ideas floating around in Zusak's word choice. Could these be, themes or ideas that we see grow throughout this novel? Entirely possible. But right now, just in his word choice here, in trying to get those emotions across, I'm seeing these seeds here, this grief, this idea of loss, okay? The utter despair that comes from it. He even uses that word exactly. So as we move through part 1, I want you to be on the lookout for these things, for these steel traits, what Liesel does, what she says, the effect that she has on others, her actions. Same thing with other characters. Pay attention to how those steel traits affect the story. Look for those conflicts. For example, keep an eye out for this conflict here, where she can't speak too well, she can't read very well. Keep an eye out for how this conflict develops as we move through part 1. Look at the figurative language. Death is very verbose. They've got a great vocabulary. Keep an eye out for how the descriptions that Death uses as they narrate this story. And then also be on the lookout for these ideas, these seeds that might blossom, these theme seeds that might blossom into a full-blown universal theme and idea as we move forward. All right, heroes? If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a good time reading this book. It's a great story. Zusak's writing is wonderful. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you soon.